This is Gemara Metziah Daf Chof Gimel, and we'd like to dedicate today's Daf once again as an incredible schos, Arichos Yamim, for Daniel, Ben-ציון, Ben-Fega Ita, B'siyata Dishmaya, or Daniel Ben-ציון Ben Yehuda. Machlek is to go with the Hebrew name, the English name, but either way, Daniel Ben-ציון Ben Yehuda, Ben Vega Ita should have an incredible Arichas Yamim, should be a source of nachas for the entire Mishpacha, and Emir Hashem for all of us. So we pick it up at the bottom of Chav Beis, Amid Beis. We're about 10 lines from the bottom. The first word on the line is Machriz Makim. So now this is the point that we're going to talk about today. To start is Achrazas Makim, that we have an item that was lost. And the question is, can we give a simin based on the area that it was found? So says the Gemara of Rabba Omar, Makaim loy havi simin. Rabba says the Makaim, the place in which an item is found, that is not an identifying mark. The Itmar Makaim Rabba Omar loy havi simin, v'Rava Omar have simin. Says the Gemara, Tashema, let's ask Kasha. If one finds bundles in Rishas Harabim, the finder keeps them. Rishas Hayachid, Noitelu Machris, V'halumais, large bundles, Beim Rishas Harabim, Rishas Hayachid, Noitelu Machris. Asks the Gemara, Rabba Eichi Mitaretz La, V'Rava Eichi Mitaretz La. Says the Gemara, this is a Kasha, both on Rabba and on Rava. The simple understanding is that according to Rabba, that when we have the large bundles in Rosh Hashanah, you have to announce it. According to Rabba, what do you mean? But simin asli l'dares is not a simin. The simin that's going to be trampled is not a simin over here. It's going to be trampled. It's a shasarabim. Rava, what's the kasha? According to Rava, we're talking about small bundles. And according to Rava, why are we going to announce when you find them in the Rishos Harabim? Says the Gemara, Rabba Mitaretz Tamei b'Simin, Rava Mitaretz Tamei b'Makom. Both Rava and Rava, each is going to explain this brisa the way that they learn. Rabba is going to explain it based on a simin. Rava is going to explain it based on Makom. Truth is, for one moment, really would be apropos to take a moment to look a little bit higher in the daf, right after the two dots from yesterday's Gemara, in which we're trying to figure out this case of krichais, and the Gemara presented a machlekes Rabba and Rava, that Kasava Rabba simin asli daris loy avi simin, and Rava amar loy shanol b'davar she'ein by simin, but something that has a simin, you have to announce it. Simin asli daris have a simin. So the question is, an item that's going to be trampled, is it yes or no a simin? And the Gemara says in the aforementioned brisa, Zekash and Rabba and Rava. Rabba says we'll answer with simin. Rava says we'll answer with makim. Explains the Gemara, Rabba Taras Tamei simin krichos b'shus Rabim harilu shaloi. Why? Misham de midrasa, because the ma'aseh gets trampled, and therefore simin also the daris lo have a simin. As the Tab Rashi points out, simin also the darisu b'shus hayachid. But now, when the story revolves around the Rishus Yachid, what's the halacha that we just saw? Naitelu Machriz. You have to announce it. Says the Gemara in the top line of Chav Gimel Amid Aleph. Why? Tulei Midrasa. Because the Ma'isa on Rishus Yachid, it's not as prone to be trampled upon. There's not as many people. And therefore, if there's going to be a simin, the simin will remain. And that's what you're going to be Machriz. That's what you're going to announce. V'halumais, large bundles. Beim Rishus Harabim, beim Rishus Yachid, naitelu machriz. Why? Kivan de gabion loy midrasa. Lemaisa, large bundle, due to its size, someone is not going to walk on top of it. You don't trample over this big, tall bundle. You can envision this, haystack type of item. There's no way to trample it, and therefore it says, Rabbah, even though I normally hold simin asli l'dares is not a good siman. However, answers the Gemara, explains Rabbah in Rishus Harabim, that's the reason why you're going to keep it, because it's also Lidares, there's no siman, but the large ones are not also Lidares. Continues the Gemara 4 lines down. Now Rava, well, siman also Lidares is a good siman. How does he explain the Brisa? Rava mitaretz l'taimei b'makoim. That was as follows. Kri chayz b'rishus harabim arilu shaloi. Bundles shasrabim you can keep. Why? What is the reason according to Rava? The bundles can be kept. Siman asil adares is still a good siman. A siman that's going to be trampled is still a good siman. So why is the finder allowed to keep it? Explains Rava. The reason being the minashtafa, because it's all the announcing detail according to Rava is the makaim. But the small bundles, minashtafa, moves around, people kick it around, and therefore there's no siman. Why? It's not pushed around because not as many people, and therefore you're going to be able to announce something. Big bundles. Why? Keeping the akiri, they're heavy. Loy minashtafa. We will not be able. They will not be kicked around. So that's how Rava explains that the Brisa is referring to the makim. Tashema says the Gemara. Let's bring a raya to Rava that even an item that is going to be trampled lamaisa, the siman is considered a siman. Says the Gemara. 10 lines down, the first word line is light. Tel shema kikarais shel nachdom. Bundles of a baker ariel shalai. If you find them, you're allowed to keep them. Why? Because all bakers' breads look the same. There's no siman, so you're allowed to keep it. What's the obvious implication? Ashal balabayis. If it's the bread of a regular household person, then chayav lachris. Says the Gemara Shabal Bayis my taima. Kim this bu simin to me the other rifta din in issue. Everyone knows this person makes his bread this way. This person makes bread that way, and therefore you have to announce it because everyone's going to know this is that person's bread. Says the Gemara, whether it's a ram or it's a yachid, so what do we see clearly from this brisa? If you're going to announce bread that is found in whether it's in the public or the private, have a simin to yofta de rabba, and that of course is a strong question on Rabba. Omar lecha Rabba. Rabba doesn't give up, and he defends and says, says Rabba, it's not going to be trampled. It's not going to be trampled. It's in the middle of the street. Says Rabba, you don't walk over bread. And since the halacha is in mavirin aloichlin, and we look at Rashi, at the top of the narrow lines, Rashi says you find something in the street, you're not able to walk over it, to leave it there, therefore it will not be trampled, because the first person that finds it, he's the one that's going to pick it up. Says the Gemara, 1 second, what about Gayim? What about the fact that a guy's going to walk by and he will trample it? Says the Gemara, they're worried about kishav, they're worried about witchcraft, and therefore they as well are careful not to step on bread. Ask the Gemara, okay, we could be klavim, animals and dogs. Answers Gemara, klavim. So if Rabba successfully defends his opinion that this brisa is not a kasha on him, and he can still hold simin asil dares, loy have simin. But the case of bread is different because whether it's yidden, whether it's kaim, whether it's animals, it's not going to be trampled. It's a simple reason. Yidden don't walk over it. Kaim are worried about witchcraft, and animals, you're talking about a place without animals. Says the Gemara, after trying to ask an Rabba unsuccessfully, suggests the Gemara, lema hitatnoi. Let's say the machlekes Rabba and Rava regarding the simin ha'asil dares. Shall we suggest this is a machlekes Tanoim back from Daf Chav Amid Beis? What did the Mishnah teach us? Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, about 20 lines down, the first word of the line is Kitanoi. Said Rabbi Yehuda, called Avasheish by Shinoi, Chayiv le'achriz, anything that is unusual, you have to announce. Kitzad, Matzah Eagle of Chares. If you find a cake of pressed figs, what's inside the cake? Inside the cake is a pottery shard. Kikar, a bread, ubeteichai mais, with money inside. You have to announce it. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Mechlal, Titanikama Savar, Harel Shalai, that these items you could keep even though there's an interesting item inside of it. There's a shard, there's money. You're still allowed to keep it. Says the Gemara, let's understand clearly what is this case. Savrua. So the ones asking the kasha assume the kuli alma, everyone's an old siman haba me love have a siman. So now we're introducing a new type of siman. A siman that comes by itself is going to be siman number one. Number two, mavir na leichlin. And number two, we're assuming that one would leave food on the ground. So if that is true, then says the Gemara, my love, so what's the machlekes if you didn't tanikama? Besimin, ha'asilidaris, kamifligi. Says the Gemara that Mar Savar Tanikam is going to lo have a simin, and Umar Savar have a simin. So suggests the Gemara, let's say this machlekes Rabba and Rava is machlekes Tanikama and the Rebbe Yehuda. Amar Razin Mishmein de Rava. If it's true what you're telling me that Tanikam holds, it's not a simin, and people walk by food. So the bread, 1 second, is all the same Mishnah. Why are you announcing it? It's a simin asiladaris, and it's not a simin. So for the fact that you announced the bread shows you're wrong according to the Tanikama. Ella Amar Rav Zin Rava, a new way of learning this machlekes of Yudin Tanikama. The Kuli Alma Savar Simin Asiladares have a simin. Avir Naloichlin. So what's the machlekes Tanikama and Rav Yehuda v'hacha b'simin haba me'elov? That detail that we thought originally everyone concurs with, which was how he asked the kasha, says the Gemara, no. Simin haba me'elov kamiflagi. And what's the machlekes Tanikama simin haba me'elov? Lo have a simin. Rav Yehuda simin haba me'elov have a simin. So says the Gemara, it's not a machlekes Rabba and Rava. With regard, it's not the same machlokes, I should say, whether simin asiladares. They're arguing about simin haba me'elav, a simin that comes back on its own, meaning that it's on its own in the fact that it's this piece of pottery that's within it. Says the Gemara, that's one way of learning the Mishnah. V'Rabba Amar Lacha. Rabba would tell you 8 lines from the medium-sized lines. I'll tell you a different way of learning the Mishnah. Really, the Kuli Amma Simin Abasli Dares Loy Have Simin. Says Rabba, I can tell you that everyone holds like me. And the Imavir Naloich, no one would pass by food. So what's the machlokes? So 2 different ways of learning the Mishnah, but the bottom line is it's not a machlokes. Rava, it's not a machlekes simin asiladaris. Rather, we could translate the Mishnah as arguing about simin haba me'elav. Before we continue, actually, into the next lashon Gemara, let's just go off for 1 second. And Rashi, about 20 lines down, haba me'elav. Rashi comes along and tells us, harai lava me'elav. What's this simin haba me'elav? It's a lower level simin. Why is it a lower level simin? There's a piece of pottery in this cake of figs. There's money in this loaf of bread. So says Rashi, because a simin that could be b'me'elav, a simin that the item could have just fallen in, is a lower level simin. Going back into the Gemara, 4 lines from the medium-sized line suggests the Gemara, Ikid Yamri, another lashon. Savrua tikuli amos simin haba me'elav have simin. Simin asiladaris lo have simin. So my lab mavirin alo ichlin kam ifliki. Tamar sava mavirin, you pass by food mar savein mavirin. Says the Gemara, maybe this is precisely the detail that to argue about that Tanikama holds mavirin, one would walk by food, and Mar Sava and Rav Yehuda holds it in mavirin. Amar Rav Zvin mishmei the Rava isav dayt savar Tanikama simin asiladaris lo have simin. That a simin that's trampled, not a simin. Mavir nalech, you pass by food. Same kasha kikar shel balabais shama by machros. What are you announcing? The balabais is breads. It's in the street. People pass by it, and therefore simin asledaris is going to be trampled. It's not a simin. Elam Rav Zin Mishay the Rava the Kuliyamas Avisim and Avos Lidaris have a simin. O Mavir Nalech, then you pass by food. V'acha b'simin Abba Me'ilav Kamil Yana Kama Simin Abba Me'ilav Lo have a simin Ruvisavar have a simin. V'Rabba Amr Lacha says the Gemara in Rabbah as well can explain in the first very well line the Kuliyamas Simin Avos Lidaris Lo have a simin. Vein Mavir Nalech. And on this, so that's the second lashon how to learn up the Mishnah. We conclude with part A of today's shiur. Amar Rav Zvid Mishmei Derava Klala Davidasa. I'll tell you a klal of Aveda Kivan da Amar when one says Vay la lechasarin kis. When one says, I lost the money, miyayish le mina, that means he's miyayish, that means he despairs of ever finding it. V'amar Rav Zim Shvei Derava, helps like Hikara, Krichais, Rishus Harabim, small bundles in Rishus Harabim, Aril Shaloi, Shzayachid, Idach Nafil Rishla Yidach Hanach, Notel Machris, V'sev Davar She'ein Boi Simin, Afal Davar She'esh Boi Simin, Shazam L'Shem Shazayachid, B'nech Nafil Yidach Hanacha, Chayiv lahachris. That really wraps up the first big chunk over here, which is Rav Zvid laying down the law. Number one, we've been talking about this concept of Yush, of despair, all the way back from the beginning of the parak. Now Rav Zvid sort of translates what is the despair when one says, I lost money. Number one. And number two, Rav Zvid paskins that bundles, Rishus Harabim you could keep, Rishus Yachid, it depends from their mannerism, whether it's Terech Nafila, whether it seems like it fell there, then the finder could keep it. But if it was clear that it was placed there, you have to announce it without a simin. But davar sheyesh by simin, it comes out. You always have to announce it. And with that, we move over to Chav Gimel and Beis, and it continues the Gemara quoting the Mishnah. The next case in the Mishnah was what was found: Machroizos shel dagim, strings of fish. And the Mishnah taught us that the finder is allowed to keep them. Says the Gemara, Amai, what is the reason the finder can keep these strings of fish? Lave kesher simin. Let's say the knot that ties the fish together is a simin. Answers the Gemara, Bekitra Tzaida, talking about a regular fisherman's knot, the Kuli Al Mahachi Mekatri, everyone ties it that way. Says, okay, we'll have a minion simin. And of course, we should realize that even though this discussion is primarily around these fishermen, around the string of fish, however, the same rules would apply elsewhere. So says the Gemara, let the number of items be a simin. Says the Gemara, binyana deshavin, it's a regular standard number of fish. So asks the Gemara, minyan have a simin oilai, lemaisa. Is the minyan, is number a simin, or minyan loy have a simin? In general, is announcing the number of items, is that going to be a way to identify an item? I'll bring you a raya. Someone finds silver or copper vessels or a piece of gisrin telavar, a broken piece of lead. Any man item or you don't return it. Until the person says a sign. If he knows the weight. Simin, says the Gemara, from the fact that we see that the weight is the simin, mida minyan, nami havi simin, so proves Rav Sheishas that yes, indeed, mida and minyan is a simin. And we go to the next part of the Mishnah, Chaticha shel basar v'chulu, we're about 10 lines down. Says the Gemara, Amai, what is the reason why the person that keeps it, finds it, can keep it? Lavi mishkala simin. The weight should be a simin, like we just saw. Says the Gemara, mishkala the shavan a standard rate. But chaticha gufa simin. Let the actual piece itself be a simin. That what type of piece of the animal? Is it from the neck? Is it from the thigh? Miloi Tanya, do we not learn in a brayso? Someone found piece of fish or a fish that was bitten, chayiv lahachris. It has to be announced. Chavi yishal yayin, if someone found barrels of wine, v'shal shemen, or oil v'shal tvua, grain v'shal greigreis, or of figs v'shal zeitim of olives arelu shaloi, they belong to the finder. They can't be identified. So says the Gemara, but what does that mean? They can't be identified if it's a piece of fish. It must be where the fish comes from. So similarly, in our case, the meat, we should be able to announce where the meat comes from. Hacha says the Gemara, no. That brisa that says that it can be announced is because simana. There is a simon of the fish piska, the cut of the fish. What does that mean? Kihad the Rabbi Ravuna, as Rabbi Ravuna himself, when he would cut his meat into triangles. So therefore, the way to have a siman on meat, on fish, is if it's cut in a unique manner. And says the Gemara about 20 lines down, the first line is Dekanami, proves the Gemara that this is indeed the siman that we're talking about. Why? Diktani, because it says, it's similar to a bitten fish. Shema mina, that it's the shape of the fish, that is that which is going to be the siman. Says the Gemara, okay, so when it comes to meat, when it comes to fish, it's the shape, the cut of the item that will act as the siman. So Amar Amar, quoting the aforementioned Brisa, Chavi shal yaim shal shem shal tvuv shal goy shal zeitim harei elu shaloi. The finder keeps all these barrels. Asks the Gemara, 1 second. You have to announce these items. Amar Rav Zir, Amar Rav Masnisan Birashum. The Mishnah that said, that said that there is a simin chayiv lahachris. That's birashum, that it's sealed, and therefore the fact itself that it was resealed could act as the simin. Says Gemara, 1 second. Mechol the brayso bepatuach. Even batuach, if the brayso is talking about open barrels, aveda midasi, someone leaves over their barrel of wine, their barrel of oil, etc. That's a mamish, just giving it, losing it on its own. Amar Rav Ha'ishia b'matzif, means he covered it, but it wasn't sealed. Abaye Amar, another teres avilu tema ID b'Rosh, they're both sealed. Lo kasha kan kodem sheneftachu ha'itzois, kan la'achar sheneftachu ha'itzois. Different times. The Mishnah is talking about a case that the container was sealed before the Eitzrus opened. And therefore, before the season that they open up, the winemaker opens up to sell, then it's not common to have a sealed container. And therefore, in such a scenario, there's something to announce. But everyone's barrels are sealed because they're selling it. Therefore, no longer will act as a simin. Explains the Gemara, Kihad Rav Yaakov bar Abba Ashka Chavita. He found a barrel of wine after the storehouse has opened up the time to sell the wine. Go take it for yourself, because once the storehouse is open, no longer is it considered a simin, as everyone's barrels of wine at that point are sealed. So the answer between what's the story with barrels of wine depends on the time of year, whether it's going to be normal to have sealed barrels or not. If it's a time that it's not normal because the storehouses aren't open yet to sell their wine, in that situation, then it will be a simin. And one last shayla for the day, similar to Machlekes Rabbah and Rav that we started with today. Rav Bibi asked Rav Nachman Lamaisa. Is Malkoim a simin? I'm letting you amat chavi shal yaim shal shem shal tvuv shal korv shal zeitim aril shalai. Vis agdai de Malkoim avi simin lechers Malkoim. Very good. We just differentiated between the time of year. Well, Lamaisa, if Malkoim is a simin, who cares? You always feel to announce the Malkoim. Am Rav Zvid achmay eskinam be. Says Rav Zvid, Berikta dinara. We're dealing with containers on the riverbank, and they've been unloaded by the boats, and therefore everyone's containers are there. So such a makaim is not a simin. Amar Mari, my time Amar Rabban and the Riksa dinara lavi simin. The riverbank's not a simin. Darmina lake yechid. That's Shami ladidach. Shami nami lechavrach. Just like you have your barrels there, everyone else has their barrels there. So such a situation, the loading dock cannot be a simin. Ikidyamin the lashon Amar Amari, my time Amar Rabban and makom lavi simin. Darmina lake yechid. Shami ladidach. Hai makaim is Shami nami lechavrach. Hai makaim. And now one last story with regard to makaim. Ahu gavra da ashkach kofra beim matzarta. There was someone that found pitch in a wine press. Asli kamei de Rav Amr Lezel Shkol Shach, take it for yourself. Chazi that become a chatem. He saw that he was not so quick to take the item. He was hesitating. Amr lei zil plug lei lechia bar bremine. Go give a piece of it to Chia, my son. Meaning he's showing he really holds up the psak if he himself is going to take some of it. So says the Gemara, Lema Kusavar Rav Makam Lavi Simin. If it seems that Makam's not a Simin if he's letting the item be kept. This case is different. Maybe Makam could be a Simin. But in this case, what's going on over here is that there were weeds growing on the item. And therefore, it's clear that this pitch had been there for such a long time that the weed is growing on it. And that's why he said, take the Zephes. That's why he said he can even give it to his son. Not necessarily a raya whether Makam is a simon or not. Pick it up from Mishem Ben Elazar in the next year. B'siyata Dishmaya.